We continue Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, by starting on Lucullus. The grandfather of Lucullus had been consul. His uncle by the mother's side was Metellus, surnamed Nambidicus. As for his parents, his father was convinced of the extortion, and his mother, Cacilia's reputation was bad. The first thing that Lucullus did before he ever stood for any office or meddled with the affairs of state, being then but a youth, was to accuse the accuser of his father, Servilius, the augur, having caught him in offense against the state. The thing was much taken notice of among the Romans, who commended it as a high act of merit. Even without the provocation, the accusation was esteemed no unbecoming action, for they delighted to see young men as eagerly attacking injustice as good dogs do wild beasts. But when great animosities ensued, insomuch that some were wounded and killed in the fray, Servilius escaped. Lucullus followed his studies and became a competent speaker in both Greek and Latin, insomuch that Sulla, when composing the commentaries of his own life and actions, dedicated them to him as one who could have performed the task better than himself. His speech was not only elegant and ready for purposes of mere business, like the ordinary oratory, which will, in the public marketplace, lash as a wounded tunny does the sea, but on every other occasion shows itself dried up and perished with the want of wit. But even in his younger days, he addicted himself to the study simply for its own sake of the liberal arts, and when advanced in years, after a life of conflicts, he gave his mind, as it were, its liberty to enjoy in full leisure the refreshment of philosophy, and summoning up his contemplative faculties, administered a timely check, after his difference with Pompey, to his feelings of emulation and ambition. Besides what has been said of his love of learning already, one instance more was that in his youth, upon a suggestion of writing the Marsian War in Greek and Latin, verse and prose, arising out of some pleasantry that passed into a serious proposal, he agreed with Hortensius the lawyer and Sisenna the historian that he would take his lot, and it seems that the lot directed him to the Greek tongue, for the Greek history of that war is still extant. Among the many signs of the great love which he bore to his brother Arcus, one in particular is commemorated by the Romans. Though he was elder brother, he would not step into authority without him, but deferred his own advance until his brother was qualified to bear a share with him, and so won upon the people as, when absent, to be chosen a deal with him. He gave many and early proofs of his valor and conduct in the Marsian War, and was admired by Sulla for his constancy and mildness, and always employed in affairs of importance, especially in the mint, most of the money for carrying on the Datic War being coined by him in the Peloponnesus, which by the soldiers' wants was brought into rapid circulation and long continued current under the name of Lucullean coin. After this, when Sulla conquered Athens and was victorious by land, but found the supplies for his army cut off, the enemy being master at sea, Lucullus was the man whom he sent into Libya and Egypt to Aegyptus. Is that how you say it? to procure him shipping. It was the depth of winter, and he ventured with but 3 small Greek vessels and as many Rhodian galleys, not only into the main sea, but also among the multitudes of vessels belonging to the enemies who were cruising about as absolute masters. Arriving at Crete, he gained it, and finding the Cyrenians harassed by long tyrannies and wars, he composed their troubles and settled their government, putting the city in mind of that saying which Plato once had oracularly uttered of them, who, being requested to prescribe laws to them and mold them into some sound form of government, made answer that it was a hard thing to give laws to the Cyrenians, abounding as they did in wealth and plenty, for nothing is more intractable than man when in felicity, nor anything more docile than when he has been reduced and humbled by fortune. This made the Cyrenians so willingly submit to the laws which Lucullus imposed upon them. From thence, sailing into Egypt, and pressed by pirates, he lost most of his vessels, but he himself, narrowly escaping, made a magnificent entry into Alexandria. The whole fleet, a compliment due only to royalty, met him in full array, and the young Ptolemy showed wonderful kindness to him, appointing him lodging and diet in the palace, where no foreign commander before him had been received. Besides, he gave him gratuities and presents. Not such were usually given to men of his condition, but 4 times as much, of which, however, he took nothing more than served his necessity and accepted of no gift, though what was worth 80 talents was offered him. It is reported he neither went to see Memphis nor any of the celebrated wonders of Egypt. It was, for a man of no business, a much curiosity to see such things, not for him who had left his commander in the field lodging under the ramparts of his enemies. But Ptolemy, fearing the issue of that war, deserted the Confederacy, but nevertheless sent a convoy with him as far as Cyprus, and at parting, with much ceremony, wishing him a good voyage, gave him a very precious emerald set in gold. Lucullus at first refused it, but when the king showed him his own likeness cut upon it, he thought he could not persist in the denial, for he had parted with such open offense. It might have endangered his passage. Drawing a considerable squadron together, which he summoned as he sailed out of all the maritime towns, except those suspected of piracy, he sailed for Cyprus, and there, understanding that the enemy lay in wait under the promontories for him, he laid up his fleet and sent to the cities to send in provisions for his wintering among them. But when time served, he launched his ships suddenly and went off, and, hoisting all his sails in the night, while he kept them down in the day, thus came safe to Rhodes. Being furnished with ships at Rhodes, he also prevailed upon the inhabitants of Kos and Cnidus to leave the king's side and join in an expedition against the Samians. Autochios himself drove the king's party and set the Calaphonians at liberty, having seized Epigonus the tyrant, who oppressed them. About this time, Mithridates left Pergamus and retired to Piton, where, being closely besieged by Fimbria on land, and not daring to engage with so bold and victorious a commander, he was concerting means for escape by sea, and sent for all his fleets from every quarter to attend them, which when Fimbria perceived, having no ships of his own, he sent to Lucullus, entreating him to assist him with his, in subduing the most odious and warlike of kings, lest the opportunity of humbling Mithridates, the prize which the Romans had pursued with so much blood and trouble, should now at last be lost, when he was within the net, and easily to be taken, and were he caught, no one would be more highly commended than Lucullus, who stopped his passage and seized him in his flight, being driven from the land by one and met in the sea by the other. He would give matter of renown and glory to them both, and the much applauded actions of Sulla at Orchomenus and about Taurania would no longer be thought of by the Romans. The proposal was no unreasonable thing, it being obvious to all men that if Lucullus had hearkened to Fimbria, and with his navy, which was then near at hand, have blocked up the haven, the war soon had been brought to an end, and infinite numbers of mischiefs prevented thereby. But he, whether from the sacredness of friendship between himself and Sulla, reckoning all other considerations of public or a private advantage inferior to it, or out of detestation of the wickedness of Fimbria, whom he abhorred for advancing himself by the late death of his friend and the general of the army, or by a divine fortune sparing Mithridates, then that he might have him an adversary for a time to come, for whatever reason refused to comply, and suffered Mithridates to escape, and laugh at the attempts of Fimbria. He himself alone first, near Lectum in Troas, in a sea flight overcame the king's ships, and afterwards discovering Neoptolemus lying in wait for him near Tenedos with a greater fleet, he went aboard a Rhodian quinquereme galley, commanded by Demagoras, a man of great experience at sea and friendly to the Romans, and sailed before the rest. Neoptolemus made up furiously at him, and commanded the master, with all imaginable might, to charge. But Demagoras, fearing the bulk and massy stem of the admiral, thought it dangerous to meet him prow to prow, and rapidly wheeling about, bid his men back water, and so received him astern, in which place, though violently borne upon, he received no manner of harm, the blow being defeated by falling on those parts of the ship which lay under water. By which time the rest of the fleet coming up to him, Lucullus gave order to turn again, and vigorously falling upon the enemy, put them to flight, and pursued Neoptolemus. After this he came to Sulla in Chersonesus, as he was preparing to pass the strait, and brought timely assistance for the safe transportation of the enemy. Peace being presently made, Mithridates sailed off to the Euxine Sea, but Sulla taxed the inhabitants of Asia 20,000 talents, and ordered Lucullus to gather and coin the money. And it was no small comfort to the cities under Sulla's severity that a man of not only incorrupt and just behavior, but also of moderation, should be employed in so heavy and odious an office. The Mytilenaeans, who absolutely revolted, he was willing should return to their duty, and submit to a moderate penalty for the offense they had given in the case of Marius. But finding them bent upon their own destruction, he came up to them, defeated them at sea, blocked them up in their city, and besieged them. Then sailing off from them openly in the day to Elaea, he returned privately, and posting an ambush near the city, lay quiet himself, and on the Mityleneans coming out eagerly and in disorder to plunder the deserted camp, he fell upon them, took many of them, and slew 500 who stood upon their defense. He gained 6,000 slaves and a very rich booty. We're gonna, maybe not. He was no way engaged in the great and general troubles of Italy, which Sulla and Marius created. A happy providence at the time detaining him in Asia upon business. He was as much in Sulla's favor, however, as any of his other friends. Sulla, as was said before, dedicated his memoirs to him as a token of kindness, and at his death, passing by Pompey, made him guardian to his son, which seems, indeed, to have been the rise of the quarrel and jealousy between them two, being both young men and passionate for honor. A little after Sulla's death, he was made consul with Marcus Cotta about the 176th in Olympiad. The Mithridatic War being then under debate, Marcus declared that it was not finished, but only respited for a time, and therefore upon choice of provinces, the lot falling to Lucullus, to have Gaul within the Alps, a province where no great action was to be done, he was ill pleased, but chiefly the success of Pompey in Spain fretted him, as with the renown he got there. If the Spanish War were finished in time, he was likely to be chosen general before any one else against Mithridates. So that when Pompey sent for money and signified by letter that unless it were sent him, he would leave the country and Sertorius and bring his forces home to Italy, Lucullus most zealously supported his request to prevent any pretense of his returning home during his own consulship, for all things would have been at his disposal at the head of so great an army. For Cethegus, the most influential popular leader at that time, owing to his always both acting and speaking to please the people, had, as it happened, a hatred to Lucullus, who had not concealed his disgust at his debauched, insolent, and lawless life. Lucullus, therefore, was at open warfare with him, and Lucullus Quintius also, another demagogue, who was taking steps against Sulla's constitution and endeavoring to put things out of order by private exhortations and public admonitions. He checked in his designs and repressed his ambition wisely and safely, remedying a great evil at the very outset. At this time news came that Octavius, the governor of Cilicia, was dead, and many were eager for the place. Courting Cethegus as the man best able to serve them, Lucullus set little value upon Cilicia in itself, no otherwise than as he thought, by his acceptance of it, no other man beside himself might be employed in the war against Mithridates, by reason of its nearness to Cappadocia. This made him strain every effort that the province might be allotted to himself, and to none other, which led him at last to an expedient not so honest or commendable, as it was serviceable for compassing his design, submitting to necessity against his own inclination. There was one Prachia, a celebrated wit and beauty, but in other respects nothing better than an ordinary harlot, who, however, to the charms of her person, adding the reputation of one that loved and served her friends, by making use of those who visited her to assist their designs and promote their interests, had thus gained great power. Well, say no one's completely a problem, are they? But she had seduced Cethegus, the first man at that time in reputation and authority of all the city, and enticed him to her love, and so had made all authority follow her. For nothing of moment was done in which Cethegus was not concerned, and nothing but Cethegus without Prachia. This woman, Lucullus, gained to his side by gifts and flattery, and a great price it was in itself. To so stately and magnificent a dame to be seen engaged in the same cause with Lucullus. And thus he presently found Cethegus, his friend, using his utmost interest to procure Cecilia for him, which when once obtained, there was no more need of applying himself either of Prachia or Cethegus, for all unanimously voted him to the Mithridatic war, by no hands likely to be so successfully managed as his. Pompey was still contending with Sertorius and Metellus, by age unfit for service, which two alone were the competitors who could prefer any claim with Lucullus or that command. Cotta, his colleague, after much ado in the Senate, was sent away with the fleet to guard the Propontis and defend Bithynia. Lucullus carried with him a legion under his own orders and crossed over into Asia, and took the command of the forces there, composed of men who were all thoroughly disabled by dissoluteness and rapine, and the Fimbrians, as they were called, utterly unmanageable by long want of any sort of discipline. And yeah, if you're violating the rights of others, that can cause a person to be disabled, and you know, you think you're just humiliating or punishing or whatever. No, but you're causing disability, and you're causing people to be a burden on others. So yeah, this is one of the big problems with armies, is the whole, one, is the war just in the first place, and two, I mean, how many rights do you have to violate to accomplish your goals? For these were they who under Fimbria had slain Flaccus, the consul and general, and afterwards betrayed Fimbria to Sulla, a wilful and lawless set of men, but warlike, expert, and hardy in the field. Lucullus in a short time took down the courage of these, and disciplined the others, who then first in all probability knew what a true commander and governor was, whereas in former times they had been courted to service, and took up arms at nobody's command, but their own wills. The enemy's provisions for war stood thus: Mithridates, like the sophists, boastful and haughty at first, set upon the Romans with a very inefficient army, such, indeed, as made a good show, but was nothing for use. But being shamefully routed and taught a lesson for the second engagement, he reduced his forces to a proper serviceable shape, dispensing with the mixed multitudes and noisy menaces of barbarous tribes of various languages, and with ornaments of gold and precious stones a greater temptation to his victors than security to the bearers. He gave his men broad swords like the Romans, and many shields, chose horses better for service than show, drew up 120,000 foot in the figure of the Roman phalanx, and had 16,000 horse, besides chariots armed with scythes, no less than 100, besides which he set out a fleet, not at all cumbered with gilded cabins, luxurious baths, and women's furniture, but stored with weapons and darts and other necessaries, and thus made a descent upon Bithynia. Not only did these parts willingly receive him again, but almost all Asia regarded him as their salvation from the intolerable miseries which they were suffering from the Roman moneylenders and revenue farmers. The sharecropping thing, right? And this lending money at interest has never stopped being the problem thereof. Some areas, I guess it might have, but these afterwards, who like harpies stole away their very nourishment, Lucullus drove away, and at this time, by reproving them, did what he could to make them more moderate and to prevent a general succession then breaking out in all parts. While Lucullus was detained in rectifying these matters, Cotta, finding affairs ripe for action, prepared for battle with Mithridates, and news coming from all hands that Lucullus had already entered Phrygia on his march against the enemies, he thinking he had a triumph all but actually in his hands, lest his colleagues should share in the glory of it, hasted to battle without him. But, being routed both by sea and land, he lost 60 ships with their men and 4,000 foot, and himself was forced into and besieged in Chalcedon. There, waiting for relief from Lucullus, there were those about Lucullus who would have had him leave Cotta and go forward in hope of surprising the defenseless kingdom of Mithridates, and this was the feeling of the soldiers in general, who were indignant that Cotta should by his ill counsel not only lose his own army, but hinder them also from conquest, which at that time, without the hazard of a battle, they might have obtained. But Lucullus, in a public address, declared to them that he would rather save one citizen from the enemy than be master of all that they had. Archelaus, the former commander in Boeotia under Mithridates, who afterwards deserted him and accompanied the Romans, protested to Lucullus that upon his bare coming he would possess himself of all Pontus, but he answered that it did not become him to be more cowardly than huntsmen, to leave the wild beasts abroad and seek after sport in their deserted dens. Having so said, he made towards Mithridates with 30,000 foot and 2,500 horse. But on being come in sight of his enemies, he was astonished at their numbers, and thought to forbear fighting, and wear out time. But Marius, whom Sertorius had sent out of Spain to Mithridates with forces under him, stepping out and challenging him, he prepared for battle. In the very instant before joining battle, without any preparation, without any perceptible alteration proceeding, on a sudden the sky opened, and a large, luminous body fell down in the midst between the armies, in shape like a hogshead, but in color like melted silver, insomuch that both armies in alarm withdrew. This wonderful prodigy happened at Phrygia near Lucullus, after this, began to think with himself that no human power and wealth could suffice to sustain such great numbers as Mithridates had for any long time in the face of an enemy, and commanded one of the captives to be brought before him, and first of all asked him how many companions had been quartered with him, and how much provision he had left behind him. And when he had answered him and commanded him to stand aside, then asked a second and a third same question, after which, comparing the quantity of provisions with the men, he found that in 3 or 4 days' time his enemies would be brought to want. Well, caused them to stop and think, or at least take a momentary break in the problem. So perhaps there really was a gathering of demons that the meteor approached. It doesn't just, saying stuff like that doesn't do anything about its physical reality. It doesn't, claims about physical reality don't, refute that, really. but it'd be interesting to see what the stone actually looks like. This all the more determined him to trust to time, and he took measures to store his camp with all sorts of provision, and thus living in plenty, trusted to watch the necessities of his hungry enemy. This made Mithridates set out against the Gazicanians, miserably shattered in the fight at Chalcedon, where they lost no less than 3,000 citizens and 10 ships, and that he might the safer steal away unobserved by Lucullus immediately after supper. By the help of a dark and wet night, he went off, and by the morning gained the neighborhood of the city, and sat down with his forces upon the Adrastean Mount. Lucullus, on finding him gone, pursued, but was well pleased not to overtake him with his own force in disaster, and he sat down near what is called the Thracian village, an admirable position for commanding all the roads and the places whence and through which the provisions for Mithridates' camp must of necessity come. And judging now of the event, he no longer kept his mind from his soldiers, but when the camp was fortified and the work finished, called them together, and with great assurance told them that in a few days, without the expense of blood, he would give them victory. Mithridates besieged the Gazicanians. Where is that nowadays? Because it makes you think of Czechoslovakians or something, right? With 10 camps by land, and with his ships occupied the strait that was betwixt their city and the mainland, and so blocked them up on all sides. They, however, were fully prepared stoutly to receive him, and resolved to endure the utmost extremity, rather than forsake the Romans. That which troubled them most was that they knew not where Lucullus was, and heard nothing of him, thought at that time his army was visible before them. But they were imposed upon by the Mithridatians, who, showing them the Romans encamped on the hills, said, "Do you see those? Those are the auxiliary Armenians, Medes, whom Tigranes has sent to Mithridates." They were thus overwhelmed with thinking of the vast numbers round them, and could not believe any way of relief was left them, even if Lucullus should come up to their assistance. Demonax, a messenger sent in by Archelaus, was the first who told them of Lucullus's arrival, but they disbelieved his report, and thought he came with a story invented merely to encourage them, at which time it happened that a boy, a prisoner who had run away with the enemy, was brought before them, who, being asked where Lucullus was, laughed at their jesting, as he thought, but finding them in earnest, with his finger pointed to the Roman camp, upon which they took courage. The lake Dascalitis was navigated with vessels of some little size. One, the biggest of them, Lucullus drew ashore, and carrying her across in a wagon to the sea, filled her with soldiers, who, sailing along unseen in the dead of the night, came safely into the city. What they considered to be gods and goddesses themselves, too, in admiration of the consistency of the Gazicanians, seem to have animated them with manifest signs, more especially now in the festival of Proserpine, or a black heifer, being wanting for sacrifice, they supplied it by a figure made of dough, which they set before the altar. But the holy heifer, set apart for the female entity, was it a Hathor equivalent? And at that time, grazing with the other herds, the Kazikenians on the other side of the strait. Well, left the herd and swam over to the city alone and offered herself for sacrifice. So, the other side of the strait would indicate one of these countries. So we could be, well, it'd have to be one of these countries, but yeah, we could be talking about the Czechoslovakians, right? I'm not entirely sure, so. By night also, the female entity appearing to Ristagoras, the town clerk, I am come, said she, and having brought the Libaon piper against the Pontic trumpeter, bid the citizens therefore to be of good courage. While the Kazikenians were wondering what the words could mean, a sudden wind sprung up and caused a considerable motion on the sea. The king's battering engines, the wonderful contrivance of Nicondes of Thessaly, then under the walls, by their crackling and rattling, soon demonstrated what would follow, after which an extraordinary tempestuous south wind succeeding shattered in a short space of time all the rest of the works, and by a violent concussion threw down the wooden tower 100 cubits high. It is said that in Idiom, Minerva, okay, that's the entity we're talking about, appeared to many that night in their sleep, with the sweat running down her person, and showed them her robe torn in one place, telling them that she had just arrived from relieving the Kazikenians, and the inhabitants to this day show a monument with an inscription including a public decree referring to the fact. And